Well, hello, I'm Andy Whiten from the University of St Andrews, and I'm going to offer you an introductory overview to this module. And of course that should also be an introductory overview to the field as a whole, because that's what we're trying to cover, at least at an introductory level. I'm going to start with some core concepts in our field. What do we mean by culture, by tradition, social learning, and so on? And I'm going to weave into that something about the early history of our subject, which now goes back about 70 years, and something of the approaches, the methods that have been used to discover all we have. Then there's going to be a section called the reach of animal culture, and that's partly about the reach of what we've discovered across the animal kingdom, which you can get some idea about already from some of the pictures here. But also I want to deal with some of the broader implications of what we've found out. And then finally I'm going to have a section I'm calling Comparing Animal Cultures. What we've discovered has enormous diversity across the animal kingdom and the kind of social learning processes that are involved. So how should we make sense of all this diversity? How can we compare cultural phenomena in animals as diverse as some of these? Well, I'm going to talk about some what I hope are intelligent and systematic ways to start to do that. So if we start with these key concepts, core concepts, in the middle of this pyramid here that I'll explain more in a moment is social learning, an absolutely key concept. And broadly this is just learning from others. But in the literature you'll see some more technical definitions. Here's one that's commonly cited due to Celia Hayes. Learning that's influenced by observation of or interaction with another animal, typically a conspecific. But it doesn't have to be. There could be learning from other species. Learning from another animal or its products. And that last bit's quite important because it emphasises that although an animal could learn by watching what another animal does from its behaviour, they might also learn from some of the results of that behaviour, such as perhaps the food remains that have been left behind, or what a tool is used for, the results of using that tool, or even from discarded tools themselves. So that's important. I think there is perhaps a limitation in this definition because it talks about observation of another animal, which seems to imply that we're only talking about the visual mode. But of course animals may learn from others using other senses. One that's really important is what they hear from others. So we need to interpret this broadly. Observation of must include listening to and the vocal learning that may ensue. And the first example I've got to illustrate social learning, and indeed how we identify it, and something about the history of our subject, comes from bird song and what songbirds learn from others. In this study by Bill Thorpe in Cambridge, back in the 1950s, so really important as foundation in our studies, he was looking at chaffinches, European chaffinches. Now the European chaffinch's song sounds like this. And ornithologists divide that into three main segments. If we look at a spectrograph which shows the frequency of the sounds over time, we see there's a repeated series of notes here, and then another repeated series at lower frequency, and then what's called a terminal flourish. So just listen again and see if you can pick that up. And what Thorpe did was to study birds who were reared with others, and they then tended to sing a song like this so-called wild type song. But importantly, he then reared some birds by themselves. And these solo birds then didn't have any other chaffinches to learn from, and they sang songs, but those looked like this, just a repeated series of notes, but they don't have this three-part hierarchical structure. They don't show this quite distinctive terminal flourish. So listen to that. And then compare that, if your ear's getting tuned to this, with the wild type, and that structure and the terminal flourish. So because of this difference, we can tell that social learning has taken place. And this is a classic kind of study. You have one experimental condition in which the participants can learn from some model, and then there's another condition in which they can't, because there's no model in this case to hear, or in another experiment to watch. And if there's then a difference between the behaviour that results, well, we know for sure that social learning has taken place. So those experiments were important. They can identify social learning. Tradition goes a step beyond this. A distinctive behaviour pattern shared by two or more individuals in a social unit, which persists over time, and that new practitioners acquire in part through socially aided learning, social learning for short. Well, I'm going to give you an example of this, which continues the theme of birdsong, because Peter Marler and his colleagues, again way back at the origins of our subject now in the 1960s, showed that birds in different regions had different dialects of the species song. I'm going to illustrate that with a slightly later study, but I think this one's nice because you can see from the spectrographs that all of these songs are identifiable as the songs of the same species, but they vary. They have different dialects, just as of course of human populations across some large region also have different dialects. And we know this can't be due to genetics from the experiments, and Peter Marler did some of the similar kind of experiments that Bill Thorpe did, that we know from those laboratory experiments that these dialects are socially learned and special to that particular location. Moving from birdsong to a different aspect of behaviour, this was also important in the origins of our subject. These little birds, blue tits and great tits, were discovered in the early part of the last century to discover that they could approach milk bottles and either tear off the top or pierce it and get the cream underneath. And what James Fisher and Robert Hine did was to gather together reports of this behaviour, which had been contributed by amateur ornithologists to journals like British Birds. And when they did that, they found that originally it seemed to occur only in two particular regions, one in the south of England around London and another one in the north of England, but then over time it gradually diffused out. So 12 years later it's found pretty much all over England and up into Scotland, Wales and even Northern Ireland. So that's far too quick for those changes to have taken place through genetic change. It surely is through social learning, and that's underlined by the way in which it diffuses gradually across an area. And nowadays sophisticated statistical techniques have been invented and applied to identify these kind of patterns and therefore pin down social learning, even when perhaps we can't do experiments, which can be important if we're studying animals like whales, where such experiments, as I've talked about already, are not that practical. So you're going to hear more about those kind of studies later in the module. Now this behaviour, of course, was novel. It's sometimes referred to as an innovation. Certainly when it starts to spread, originally it might be called an invention when the first individual does it, but then as it spreads, it's a socially passed on innovation. And here was a nice instance of it. And it's sometimes said that traditions and culture, which we're going to come on to in a moment, are driven by two main engines. One is some innovation capacity, and then the social learning which spreads it across a population. The same is true of the third foundation study I'm going to refer to, which was of primates, of these Japanese monkeys that had been fed sweet potatoes like this and cast on the beach, so they got sandy. But one juvenile female, emo, worked out that you could take these into a stream and wash them and get the sand off. And what happened was that, well, if we put a monkey like this into the position of emo here. Later others picked it up, and they're indicated by all the animals in her own family with these rectangles round, but also you can see it spread to adjacent families too. And in fact, again, the diffusion was described because it started with her peers, the individuals she interacted with most, then it spread up from some of them to their mothers, and once the mothers had it, then it spread to all their offspring subsequently. So again, there's diffusion across a particular social network that pins this down as due to social learning. So that's social learning and what it may lead to, tradition. But I say may lead to, that's the point of this stepped pyramid here. Not all social learning leads to tradition. You can illustrate that by now bringing in another species, bumblebees. A nice study showed that bumblebees also socially learn from other bumblebees. To begin with, however, this might just be what we might call social information transfer. Bees see a lot of bees around one particular flower bed rather than another, and that's what they're attracted to. They've not necessarily learned anything yet, or at least we can't tell if they have. They're just more attracted to that flower bed. But if later on we find that same bee or bees come back to that flower bed when there aren't other bees there, then clearly they've learned something and are now applying that later on. So social information doesn't necessarily lead to social learning, but it may, and social learning may lead to tradition, but not necessarily. In other words, there are a lot of transient effects of these kind of processes. However, social learning is vital for tradition. Here's just one example of that. Young orangutans have been shown to carefully watch what their mothers are eating, and their diet comes to map very much to the distribution of foods that their particular mother ate, and indeed is common in one particular area, whereas the same process going on elsewhere can lead to a somewhat different diet set, even though the availability of foods is the same. So social learning may lead to tradition. Now let's bring in culture. This is more problematic insofar as we find that some researchers simply equate culture and tradition, where we've already defined tradition, so for them, well, if you see a tradition, then you could call that culture, and sometimes the expression is used, cultural traditions. It's not obvious what traditions are going to be other than something that is cultural. But others want to have a step up and say, no, we need more criteria or higher criteria to ascribe culture. And that's really because people are thinking about human culture. Human culture is so much more rich, complex, sophisticated in various ways than anything we see in the animal world. Some researchers, and perhaps particularly cultural anthropologists whose whole life is to study that, want to have extra criteria. And those are often human-like criteria. But Bennett Galef, known in the field as Jeff Galef, one of the foundation researchers in our field, he argued this, that culture should involve rather complex human-like social learning, such as full-blown imitation or teaching. Otherwise, he said, let's talk about tradition in animals. So whether this occurs or not is something we're going to be addressing. But different researchers therefore use different criteria. For some, these are synonyms. For others, extra criteria are needed. And to underline this notion about different definitions, I can refer you to a work by Kroeber and Kluckhorn, cultural anthropologists, who back in 1952 already, surveying the literature, found 168 different definitions of culture. And of course there have been decades since in which more have emerged. So the basic lesson is here: beware, look for the definition of culture in any particular paper you read, and that's the notion of culture that's being addressed there. And if and when you come to write your own scientific papers later on, please make sure you define the terms, and culture is an important one to define. I'll illustrate this point just with one more study, which is due to myself and Carol van Schaik, in which in a way we took the same attitude as Galef, but instead of asking for extra criteria in the social learning processes, we wanted to look at the pattern of traditions and suggested that culture might be usefully distinguished so that these words, as it were, do different jobs for us as a term for multiple tradition cultures. We did that for two main reasons, I guess. One is that if you're thinking about human culture, and if we want to compare different cultures, if we want to compare perhaps the cultures of China with Scotland, where I live, well, what we're going to start to do is reel off an array of traditions. The kind of foods that people eat, how they prepare them, their cuisine, the way people dress, the way they decorate themselves, the kind of social customs they follow, like this procession here, their technologies, their communication patterns, the way they speak, the language they speak, if they have a written language, how they write that. In other words, culture is really then an array of traditions. And in the original studies that I've already talked about in animal behavior, like the bird song or the Japanese potato washing, one tradition was identified, but it wasn't necessarily a multiple tradition culture. But these have been found, and this is the second reason really why Van Schaik and I suggested this notion that we were studying great apes. For me it was chimpanzees, for Van Schaik orangutans. And in this study, these co-authors of mine here were the leaders of the long-term research site, and this was the first effort to synthesize all that they had discovered through a total of 150 years of research across the study sites by then. This whole process, of course, started decades before. Here's Jane Goodall in the Gombe Stream Reserve, and her studies were followed then by others following chimpanzees across different regions of Africa. And what started to emerge was that chimpanzees in different regions behave sometimes in different ways, as of course do people, and in the case of people that's typically attributed to differences in culture. And that notion which started to emerge was underlined by close observations of this kind of behaviour. Here we have a youngster, Fifi, very closely watching what her mother, Fifi, is doing, which in this case is termite fishing, and here's the stem she's fished some termites out of a mound with. If we put these together, these regional differences and this kind of behaviour, we seem to have some of the foundations for culture. Well, in this study in 1999, we pulled all this information together, and the conclusions we came to, and I'll talk more about this in a later lecture in more detail, but the conclusion we came to is that chimpanzees have as many as 39 different traditions and cultural variants, and those are defined because they're customary or habitual at one site, very common, and yet they're absent somewhere else without, so far as we can see, any obvious environmental or genetic explanation. So here in each of these panels is the 39 possibilities. They're lit up as squares if they're customary, slightly less common circles if they're what we call habitual, and they're just blue circles if they're absent. You can't read all of those. Let me blow one up and you can start to see some of the descriptions or the labels we gave to these behaviours. The important point is that the scope of these traditions pretty much span most of chimpanzee kinds of behaviour, so including things like the way they process complicated foods, the way they use tools, partly for that food processing, but also for hygiene and for comfort functions, aspects of their social behaviour, their grooming techniques, how they groom each other, what they do with a parasite, having groomed it off another individual, and then also some of their courtship gambits. So a whole range of behaviours, and the chimpanzees in any one location, their culture is, as it were, defined by an array of multiple traditions. I don't have time to illustrate all of these, just to give you a feel for this, I'll mention the first one is the top left there, pestle pounding, and in this, chimpanzees in Bosu, but only in Bosu, go to the top of a palm tree, and they are taking food from the growing point, which is very nutritious. They can take what they can manually, but then they use one of the big fronds that have often been left there from before to pound into this growing point like a big pestle and mortar. There's a little cartoon of it, and then a video clip. It's So at Bosu, pretty much everybody does this. It's customary, but not elsewhere. So that's one other notion of what culture could be thought of as it were one step beyond the mere existence of at least a tradition. But then we have to add finally cumulative culture as a subset of all the phenomena that are cultural. Cumulative culture is culture that builds up on what went before. And human culture is redolent of this. Here's an illustration of our longest historical example of this, which is the evolution of axes and hammers, which is a story now we know extends beyond 3 million years, from early stone tools to hafted axes, and then a whole variety of different kinds of hammers with different functions. A claw hammer here that you can take nails out with as well as hammering them in, and finally a Victorian steam hammer. And this kind of cumulative culture characterizes much of human culture. We see it all around us. We see it in our digital technology around us now. We see it in our languages. Here's a language evolution tree. Here's the Germanic branch, and somewhere in there is English that I'm speaking at the moment, but just one branch. And any one of these languages is also evolving all the time, building on what went before. So in the last century we had the discovery of something that then had its own term, DNA, and then later on Richard Dawkins coined the term memes for what he suggested might be the cultural equivalent of genes. And sometimes people talk about things being in their cultural DNA, or this new meme is spreading, some new tune that we can't all help humming. Well, that's a quick overview of these key concepts and how they all fit together, and a little introduction to some of the history of our subject and the methods that have been used, observational and experimental. I'm now going to launch into a section I'm calling the reach of animal culture, and there's several parts to this. The first one refers to the phylogenetic reach of culture, which you've already appreciated is broad. We talked about primates, birds and bees. Just to rub home this, of course you're going to hear more about this through the whole module, but just to push home the idea, the smallest animal, I guess, that this has been looked at in is fruit flies, Drosophila. Etienne Danchin, the lead author of this study, is someone you'll be hearing from later in the module, and you'll hear more about this study in particular. But I want just to introduce it because it involves a kind of behavior I've not talked about yet, and that is mate choice copying. What you see here in this image is at the top a male who's been dusted green by experimenters, and he is the lucky one mating with a female, whereas at the bottom there is this pink dusted male who it's not his lucky day, he's not mating, and looking on to this scenario are two females. And in mate choice copying, what's discovered is that if these females are then later allowed to mate with males, they will tend to prefer, if this has been their experience, green dusted males, or if the experimenters evolve pink ones that they're mating with, then that's what they'll prefer. They prefer what most females have indicated is a good male to mate with. Danshin et al. Took this one stage further, and that's why we see cultural in the title here and traditions. He allowed these females then to become the models in their mating preferences for more females, and then those females became the models for others. So it goes a bit like a kind of series of gossip, where the gossip goes from A to B, from B to C, and from C to D, and so on, possibly over a quite long series. And in fact, in this experiment, they had 8 of these steps, which we might call cultural generations, in which one lot of flies learned from the next. And this preference continued across those. Modelling suggested it would go on for even longer, but you'll hear more about the details of that from Danshin himself later on. So that's all I'll say about phylogenetic reach. You'll hear more about that in the rest of the module. But even if you look within a particular species, we may find social learning to be pervasive. For example, in a review recently by myself and Erica van der Waal, we looked at this across primate lifetime development and divided this up into 3 main phases. The first phase is the one illustrated by photographs like this, where a youngster is very intently focusing on what their mother does. And of course, young primates, they have a long period of lactation in which they're with the mother carries them around on her front, then on her back often, and so in the case of great apes, they may spend years intimately linked with their mother, and so she's the main model from which they learn all in their early life, such as what to eat, in the case of chimpanzees, how to use tools, and so on. But then the social network expands, and it expands in different rates in different species. But it tends to expand, and that's what we're referring to in phase 2, where there's then learning from others. And this can be particularly important as an example here, where you're looking at a very sexually dimorphic species like gorillas. So an adult silverback male gorilla, because of his size, can have a somewhat different diet than can females. And what that means is that the young male can learn only so much from his mother, and as he develops and the network of contacts expands, he can learn something by apprenticing himself, as it were, to adult males like this, and that's been identified in other species too. There's been a recent quite challenging paper by Caroline Schupley and Carol van Schaik referring to what's happening in these first 2 phases and saying, well, maybe actually that our approach has only revealed so far the tip of an iceberg, and what they're focusing on is this kind of behaviour that they're now giving a label to, peering, where youngsters very closely attend to what adults do. And what they suggest is that having identified certain criteria suggest that really social learning is going on in these. If we enumerate all the different contexts in which that occurs, then we come up with much larger numbers for the scope of ape culture in this case than those figures of like 39 different traditions when we're comparing different chimpanzee communities. Here, if we count up the number of things that the youngsters peer closely at in this way, it can be well over 100. In one study of the orangutans, over 190. Well, that's quite a recent controversial claim. We'll have to see where that goes, but it's worth noting at this point. So that's phases 1 and 2. Phase 3 is where animals disperse, and typically it's sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes both species disperse at maturity, and that avoids inbreeding. We learned something about this in a study by Erica van der Waal and myself. Erica van der Waal is someone you'll hear from later in the module, and you'll hear more about this study. But the essential point was that we started out studying one thing, which was really to test this kind of phase 1 process by taking corn that the animals had once a month for other reasons, dividing it into two and dyeing some of it pink and some of it blue, making one of those taste horrible, so that over time the animals quite quickly learned to eat one and ignore the other. So we had two groups eating blue and two eating pink. We did that while the infants were still being fed milk, and so weren't eating solid food. And then we brought it back later on, presented the blue and the pink, but now without any nasty material in either, to youngsters who started to take solid food, to see, well, would they just learn by trial and error to eat both, or would they be influenced by the habits of their group? And we found that yes, very much so. They really just started to eat what their mother, and indeed generally the rest of the group, were favouring in the particular group they lived in. Well, so well and good. What was really lucky on our part is that we could take it one step further and look at dispersing males. So now we are talking about phase 3. We had instances where, for example, there were 3 males here who were in a group initially where everyone ate blue and ignored the pink, but then they migrated into a group like this where they're looking around and everybody's eating pink rather than blue. What would they do? What we found was they changed very quickly and locked on to the local preference. So what this underlines is that in phase 3, when animals disperse, they're moving into a different habitat sometimes. There may be new foods to learn about, new foods to avoid, should be to learn they should avoid. And they've also got to learn about social relations as well. And what's one of the quickest and easiest ways to learn about that? Well, to watch what others do, what others eat, who others pay particular respect to perhaps, and so on. So you'll hear more about that later. But that's illustration of the pervasiveness of culture across these different phases in primates. But it's not just in primates that we see this pervasiveness. I'll just quote from this book by Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell, both of whom you're going to hear from later in the module, talking about their subject, cetaceans, whales and dolphins. And they concluded at one point that culture, we believe, is a major part of what the whales are. That's to say, it so pervades their lives that they'd be very different kind of creatures and have very different ecologies and evolutionary pathways if that wasn't the case. And although there was hardly any evidence that might support a belief like that, really published in the last century, this century has seen a lot. And so they're able to now cite 70 articles underlining what a vigorous field we're working in. I can't go through similar kind of stories for lots of different species, but I'll just put up this one slide, a list of all the contexts and contents of culture that various studies, observational and experimental, have identified social learning as playing a part in. And you can see it's pretty much most aspects of behaviour that have been studied in animals. So, a pervasiveness within species through their lifetimes perhaps, and across very different functional contexts. What about the implications for evolutionary biology more broadly? Well, I've written about this in various ways. Here's one paper, the title being A Second Inheritance System, the Extension of Biology Through Culture. What I was talking about here as a second inheritance system is as follows. Well, the primary inheritance system, of course, across all life, refers to genes, to DNA, and the second inheritance system then that is built on the back of that in at least some animals is social learning and the existence of traditions and cultures that follow. So once you've got that second system of inheritance, there's the possibility for a second system or a second kind of evolution, cultural evolution, in which traditions vary in their adaptiveness, and therefore their likelihood of being passed on. There may be further innovations, so they change, and so we get cultural evolution in a kind of Darwinian fashion. We've got variation, we've got selection, we've got inheritance, not through genes but through social learning. So this key triad of Darwinian processes, including then adaptation as well as a result. I'll just illustrate this with one study which is derived, we're back to birdsong, from a study by Heather Williams, who studied the song of these savanna sparrows over a 30-year period. And here's a diagram or a figure from this recent review, and you can see, I think, differences between this typical song in 1982 and the typical song in 2012, just looking at the spectrograph. And interestingly, these authors suggested, however, that there are three different kinds of evolutionary process going on here. One we might call neutral processes, because there isn't any change in any particular direction that's being selected for. But what we're seeing is processes that in organic evolution are referred to as mutation, genetic mutation and drift. But here the mutations are due to imperfect copying from one generation to the next. And if that's happening, well, over time, and as individuals disperse as well, you're going to get a drift, and that's what they're suggesting happens in some parts of the song here. The patterns drift from what they were like originally. But we can contrast with that directional selection. We have evidence for that in birdsong. Perhaps the best evidence is that birds that have been living in urban environments have been recorded as having songs that occur at higher frequency and therefore can be heard above the hubbub of urban noise, such as traffic noise. Well, in this case, they identified just certain parts of the song, the trills and this note complex here, that in fact they showed had shifted in one particular direction across this period, and in that direction, birds singing further in that direction had higher reproductive success. So there's evidence here of selection in that way. But then the third process is stabilizing selection. Some parts of the song stayed more similar over this period than one would expect through the processes of mutation and drift, suggesting that there are actually certain factors holding those features constant, and those might be the ones that signal, well, I'm a savanna sparrow, which is important to keep saying loudly and clearly and perhaps in the same way. So I think this is part of the new horizons in our field, to go beyond showing that certain species socially learn in a certain way, even have traditions and multiple tradition arrays that we call culture, to now start looking at cultural evolution. And you get a whole lecture on cultural evolution and the more specific aspect of cumulative culture from Nico Cladier later in the module. So that's one aspect of the significance of what we found for evolutionary biology, a second form of evolution. But then there's also the potential interaction between the primary and the secondary forms of inheritance, and we've got lots of examples of that in humans. Human culture has affected the distribution of genes in quite significant ways. Perhaps the most famous case is from the culture of dairy farming, because in those cultures then there have been changes in our physiology and genetic makeup so that milk can be more easily digested. There's a lactose tolerance, whereas in other communities around the world marked here in dark blue, that's not the case. They don't have that culture and they don't have that genetic makeup and that physiology. They're lactose intolerant. Well, in recent years, evidence has started to be forthcoming for this gene culture coevolution, as it's been called. Hal Whitehead, who you'll hear from later, has been a leading figure in this, starting by looking at these processes in whales and dolphins. More recently, others have joined with him to talk about the reach of gene culture coevolution in animals more broadly, and we've written about this in a recent paper. That's all I'll say about this, but this will be picked up in later lectures in the module. So that's implications for evolutionary biology. What about implications for human evolution? Well, in a way that you say, well, that's just part of this, isn't it? Implications for evolutionary biology, yes. But of course, we're rather specifically interested in ourselves, in our own evolution, so I've given this an extra line. How can we study this? Well, one way is through the comparative method. If we look at all our relatives, the great apes, we share a somewhat common body morphology, which means that it's not that difficult to reconstruct what our common ancestors in the ape lineage would have looked like. They have the kind of characteristics which our particular form reflects. We're like we are because we have evolved from these kind of origins. And what our project here is in the cultural realm is to do the same kind of analysis. That's to say, to ask what all these species share in their cultural phenomena, and then attribute those to ancestral forms, which then really, in a kind of circular way, explains why our cultures are like they are. The main point, I suppose, is that culture didn't just spring out of the blue in our species, but rather it's taken the forms it has because it's evolved on the back of what went before in earlier apes. And I've written about that recently. Here's a review if you want to anticipate that, but I'll talk about it more in later parts of the module. Fifthly and finally, what about the implications for conservation? This is something that's been recognised only relatively recently. Some of us were delighted to be contacted by the United Nations Environment Programme in 2018, because they assembled an expert group in animal culture to explore the implications for conservation that they were starting to suspect might be important. That resulted in a 30-page report, but if you want to see a briefer and more sparky 2 to 3 page summary of that, you can look at this article in Science, which set out the main implications of culture for conservation and also some recommendations. By coincidence, just later in the same month, in the same journal, this paper came out reporting that human impact erodes chimpanzee behavioural diversity in certain parts of Africa. And from what I've said, you can guess that the behavioural diversity is often largely cultural. One result was that both of these papers were advocating what might be a kind of radical step in the conservation world, that rather than thinking only about the conservation of species, of a genome, in other words, we should also need to be thinking about the conservation of particular cultures. And culture may also play important parts in such efforts in conservation, recognising, for example, that there are particular resources, such as the matriarch of an elephant group, who embodies an enormous extent of cultural knowledge, which is important for the group. And these kind of processes are also important where there is reintroduction of animals into the wild. That will be picked up by Hal Whitehead in the last lecture in the module. So far I've talked about the reach of animal culture in several respects, and that reach produces tremendous diversity. How should we make sense of this? How can we compare different animal cultures from species as different as these? Well, I've suggested in various papers that there are 3 main dimensions across these phenomena where we can make comparisons and see, well, what's similar and what's different. One is the transmission processes, which we can divide into types of social learning, and secondly, social learning biases or strategies, which I'll explain in a moment. Social learning is a topic which over the years, over the 70 years we've been studying it, has led to some quite complicated taxonomies of all the different kinds of social learning. This is one due to me and my colleagues, and here's an update from 2019. But essentially what we're doing here is making comparisons across perhaps relatively simple forms of social learning, like we described earlier on in those bumblebees, where there is learning about what are the best places to go or the best items to focus on, what's sometimes called the stimulus or locale enhancement of those features. And then other processes such as imitation, copying the form of an action from another, which involves a quite complicated cognitive task, if you think about it, of seeing what another individual is doing. So you've got visual information there, but what has to happen is then to transform that into motoric output that matches that corresponds to that, for there to be an imitation. It's the kind of matching that you're seeing here as this youngster matches the behaviour of the model that they're watching, an expert nutcracker in this case. I'll talk about that more again in a later lecture in the module. So that's social learning, and in addition to social learning, where we're often focusing really on the learner, we also have to think about the model who's being learned from, who may also be relatively active and therefore do something that we might want to call teaching. And both of these phenomena are ones you'll hear more about in the next lecture by Alex Thornton. But the third lecture then, building on that, we'll talk about something slightly different, which is social learning biases. For example, if you are going on holiday and you're going to the local village, you want to see which is the best restaurant to go to, and you notice that in one, well, it's pretty much full, it's well populated. There's another one where that's not the case. Well, which one are you going to choose? Following the majority is often a useful, simple rule, which underlines that although this expression biases may initially lead to an impression that we're talking about something maladaptive, a bias that's maladaptive. No, and that's why my colleague Kevin Leyland said that it might be more useful to call these social learning strategies, and that's what you're going to hear about from Rachel Kendall in lecture 3. And there are other examples of this, such as copying high status individuals, because high status individuals, there's something about them that's special, and therefore they may be good ones to copy. So those are transmission processes we can compare, and might find differences between different kinds of animals, but also some shared capacities, such as that basic stimulus enhancement notion seems to be very widespread. Cultural contents refers to the actual form the behaviour takes, which can be very different, but there can also be similarities at a certain level of analysis. For example, our cultures and those of chimpanzees embody a lot of technology, different kinds of tool use. So at that level of analysis, there are similarities in the contents, and those are very different from what we see in various other species. And these are, to put this slide up again, these are some of the contents over which we can make comparisons. If we just focus on one of these for a minute, migration routes, for example, we find that in a diagram like this, well, we might be talking about cetaceans. Whales sometimes migrate halfway around the world between their breeding grounds and their main feeding grounds in another season of the year. And we might also, that might also be a diagram for birds that migrate halfway around the world too. And of course these are very distantly related taxa of animals, and yet we're finding the same kind of phenomena in them. Whereas in other species, primates for example, don't tend to migrate very much. We don't see that kind of behaviour. So there are interesting comparisons, similarities and differences when we're looking at the particular contents of cultures. And then finally, we may make comparisons across the population level patterning of traditions, such as those patterns we saw in chimpanzees earlier, or in the bird song dialects. There may be, despite differences in the contents here, there may be interesting similarities in the way in which different traditions spread, the way they change over time, but also interesting differences. So with all of these, there's a contrast, compare and contrast operation to be done. So I think that's me done. I hope that introductory overview has whetted your appetite for the rest of the module, and that you'll enjoy it. I think you should. You're certainly going to learn an awful lot from it. I've seen some of those lectures which are typically given by experts in their fields, and there are some fascinating findings you're going to learn about. Thank you.